Welcome. This is Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're continuing in our study of Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, where we find all of the arguments for God that have developed since Hume's time. It's as if Hume could see into the future and see how people were going to try to defend God's existence, not just past arguments, but future arguments. In part 3, we have Cleanthes replying to what Philo had said. Philo talked about how there's no analogy between a house and a universe. And so now Cleanthes says that Copernicus and his first disciples had to first prove that there is a similarity between terrestrial and celestial matter. Because there were scientists blinded by old systems, that's Aristotle, that had denied this similarity. But that theists don't, in the same way, have to prove the similarity of the works of nature to those of human artifice because of the similarity is self-evident and undeniable. The works of nature are made of the same stuff as our human artifacts, and the two are alike in form also. So he's responding here to the analogy problem. And his answer is, well, look, we may not have been there when the universe was formed, but the universe is the same kind of stuff as a house, namely matter. It's not some different kind of thing. And matter doesn't organize itself. If anything, matter breaks down and becomes less organized. So we could say, suppose that an articulate voice were heard from the clouds, much louder and more melodious than any human voice could ever be. Suppose further that this voice were heard at the same time in all nations, and that it spoke to each nation in its own language and dialect. And suppose finally that the words spoken from the sky were not only meaningful, but conveyed some instruction that was altogether worthy of benevolent being who was superior to mankind. If all that occurred, could you possibly hesitate for a moment over the cause of this voice? Wouldn't you be compelled to ascribe it straight off to some design or purpose? So you hear a voice speaking in all the languages of the nations and telling you something. You wouldn't conclude, therefore, since it's a voice from up there and we don't understand how voices up there work, it's not like when we hear voices and there's intention. For all we know, it's an uncaused voice. No one would conclude that. You'd think, well, a voice that puts together sentences in numerous languages must have an intelligent source. And so he's making an analogy between that and viewing the order of the world. So he says, here's the position that you, Philo, seem to be committed to. All conclusions about matters of fact are based on experience. When we hear an articulate voice in the dark and infer that a human has spoken, it is only the resemblance of the effects which leads to us to conclude there is a similarity in the causes. So when you speak to me, I see you speaking to me. At night, it's dark and someone speaks to me. I can't see them, but I make an inference. This must be the same kind of thing as when I saw the person speaking to me. All because beginning with experience as our source of information, not reason. So this extraordinary voice from the sky is loud, wide-ranging, and flexible as to languages. So because the humans aren't like that, it must not have intelligence. So he's showing how there's the dissimilarities that Philo's using to say the universe is not like a house would in the same way say this voice isn't produced by intelligence, which would be absurd. So he's giving a counter argument now to this analogy. You can see clearly your own objections in these objections. And I hope you will also see clearly that one is no better than the other. Now, I think that's interesting, this reference to the idea of clear, because that's really the goal, to give a clear argument. an argument that proves the case. And Cleanthes has that as his goal here, and he's trying to show that he's done that. Now, just because someone says something's clear, it doesn't make it clear. We have to know how to use reason ourselves to evaluate arguments. So we're not saying that it is clear for sure. We're going to evaluate that as we go. But just that that's the goal. That's a good goal to have, a clear argument. But to bring the case still nearer to our present topic of the universe, I shall make two suppositions, which, though they are weird and not true, don't involve any absurdity or impossibility. So this is going to be like a reductio argument. Posit something absurd, show how it follows from the other guy's argument, so therefore his argument must be unsound. Suppose there is a natural, universal, invariable language common to every individual of the human race, and that books are natural products which perpetuate themselves in the same way as animals and plants. So these suppositions aren't as wildly far from fact as you might think. We do have a kind of universal language embedded in some expressions of our passions, and all the lower animals have a natural speech, which, however limited, is very intelligible to their own species. And as it is the finest and most eloquent text, is infinitely less complex and intricate than the coarsest organisms. The propagation of an Iliad or Aeneid is easier to suppose than that of any plant or animal. So this is interesting because this is before DNA. He already knows that a simple organism is way more complex than the Iliad. Now we've discovered DNA, we know all the more how much that's true, and you'll see arguments like that, right? DNA molecule can't come about by chance any more than the Aeneid or the Iliad can come about by chance. Or if you were to put a bunch of letters in a bowl, all the letters in the Iliad, shake them up, throw them out, no one would think the Iliad's going to come out, right? And DNA is even more complex than that. And yet you'll still have people who say, no, DNA came about by chance. So suppose you enter your library and the shelves of which are full of natural volumes containing the most refined reasoning and most exquisite beauty. Could you possibly open one of them and doubt that its original cause or the strongest analogy to mind? Obviously, you go over next door to the library. Each book you'll assume was written by a mind. You'll find reasoning in there, discourses. Could you still say that all this basically had no meaning and that thought and planning had no role to play when this volume was brought into being? I know you aren't as obstinate as that. Furthermore, Philo, if there is any difference between my two suppositions case and the real state of affairs in the universe, it is the latter that suits my argument better. The anatomy of an animal presents many stronger instances of design than the reading of Livy or Tacitus does. And any objection you start in the real world case, demanding that we attend to such an unusual and extraordinary scene as the first formation of worlds, holds equally in the two suppositions case. So the idea that you can't know if the universe was designed unless you were there at the beginning is absurd. We don't apply that in the case of, say, animals. You had to be there when animals started to see that they're organized and have design. Let me add, Cleanthes, that this religious argument, instead of being weakened by the skepticism that you keep parading, is actually strengthened by it, becoming more firm and undisputed. To reject all argument and reasoning is either affectation or madness. So it's interesting here. The skeptic can't reject reason because the skeptic would be using reason to reject reason, which is a kind of madness, or an affectation, which means just doing it for the sake of keeping the argument going. Every reasonable skeptic rejects only argumentation that is abstruse, remote, and intricate, and sticks to common sense and plain instincts of nature. So interesting here, he adds to reason and argument, he adds common sense and instinct. And I think that weakens his case because both of those could be easily shown to be often wrong, incorrect. But the point of a skeptic is not to reject reason. The point of the skeptic is to use reason to highlight fallacious arguments that are given. So the arguments for natural religion are plainly of this forceful, most irresistible kind, and nothing but the most perverse and obstinate metaphysics can reject them. Think about the anatomy of the eye, consider its structure and design, and then tell me, doesn't the idea of a designer immediately come into your mind with a force like that of a sensation? You've probably had some biology class in the past on the eye, and you know how it has to work as a complete unit. If you take away any piece of the eye, it doesn't work at all. So it had to come fully formed into the world. It couldn't have started off just a retina and a lens in a retina. Those wouldn't have been of any use. So the eye is a complex unit that indicates design. The most obvious conclusion is a designer. And that immediately strikes us, he says, whereas you have to take time to come up with arguments against it. And there are millions and millions of such instances. So however you may carp at it, the argument that likens an orderly world to a coherent, articulate speech will still be accepted as an incontestable proof of design and intention. So that's why I said at the beginning that he's anticipating arguments that come later. The argument from DNA, the eye as irreducible complexity, or Richard Dawkins, the blind watchmaker, who says you can get a sentence, a coherent sentence, the way I said earlier, throwing out the letters, but here's the catch. Every time that's random, the sentence he uses is, methinks it is a weasel. And so you have all those letters together and they come out randomly. If any of them's in the right spot, it stays there for the next iteration. So eventually all of them will be in the right spot because some of the spots are blocked off and those letters aren't recycled. Well, sure, but that's not how nature works. Each time you get it wrong, you would die, you wouldn't even live, and you start over. You don't get those things in place and then keep going. So that's what I'm saying. Hume here is anticipating a lot of these things, and later thinkers aren't aware of how they're just repeating Hume. So if this argument for theism conflicts with principles of logic, as you claim it does, its irresistible power over nearly everyone clearly shows there may be arguments that are good, although they break the rules. So curious here, an argument that breaks the rules. This is going to come back to get Cleanthes, but you'll find theists do that sometimes. I have this argument, it's really good, and you have to accept that even though it breaks the rules of logic. Don't dismiss this as special pleading, for we do sometimes accept rule-breaking performances as good, even as excellent. We sometimes encounter beauties in writing that seem contrary to the rules. So it sometimes happens, I admit, that the religious arguments don't have the influence they should have on an ignorant, savage, and barbarian, not because they are obscure and difficult, but because the savage never asks himself any of the questions on which they depend. Where does the intricate structure of an animal come from? Where do the parents come from and their parents? So the problem isn't in the arguments, the problem is in the person who's never reflected on those questions before. Once you begin to reflect on those questions, you see how the argument does follow. So the rules here, I guess he's taking rules to mean cultural rules, social rules, even though he said rules of logic. Conflicts with the principles of logic specifically. So it's curious here, his argument at this point would begin to unravel. So you can trace causes from effects. You can compare the most distant and remote objects, and your greatest errors proceed not from barrenness of thought, but from too luxuriant a fertility, which suppresses your natural good sense by a profusion of unnecessary doubts and objections. So there are some doubts and objections which are unnecessary. just doubting everything all the time. You have to eventually accept some conclusions. Now, Demea speaks up at this point. And you think Demea likes what Philo is doing because Demea is also a theist. But your examples involving books and language, he said to Cleanthes, gets much of its force from being familiar. But isn't there some danger in this very familiarity? May it not lead us to get above ourselves by making us imagine we can comprehend God? When I read a book, I enter into the mind of the author. At that moment, I become him. But we can never come as close to that as that to God. His ways are not our ways. His attributes are perfect, but incomprehensible. And his book of nature contains a great and inexplicable riddle. The ancient Platonists, as you know, were the most religious and devout of all the pagan philosophers. Yet many of them, particularly Plotinus, expressly declare that intellect or understanding is not to be ascribed to God, and that our most perfect worship of him consists not in acts of veneration, reverence, gratitude, or love, but rather in a certain mysterious self-annihilation or total extinction of all our faculties. These ideas are perhaps too far stretched, but still there is truth in them. So Demea's argument is the problem for Cleanthes isn't that there is no God. The problem for Cleanthes is there is a God and we can't understand anything about God. He's so far beyond us. All the sentiments of the human mind clearly involve the state and situation of man, and so they can't be projected onto God. So on one hand, Philo's saying we can't know if there's a God or not, and Demea agrees, but they go different paths with that. For Philo, here at least, we're going to see in part 12, Philo sounds more like Demea, but here, Demea thinks that this makes you more pious if you behave this way. So he says, at least if it seems more pious and respectful, as it really is, still to use these words when we speak of the supreme being, we should admit that their meaning is applied to him and is totally incomprehensible, and that the weakness of our nature prevents us from having any ideas that correspond in the least to the ineffable sublimity of God's attributes. So the problem for Cleanthes is still assuming there's an analogous relationship between our experience of a book and the supreme being. And Demea is saying there's no such similarity.